The morning sun filtered through the thin curtains, casting pale streaks of light across the worn-out carpet. Sarah had just finished setting the small table in the corner of their cramped apartment. She carefully placed the single, slightly chipped plate of pancakes she had managed to whip up from the last bit of flour and milk. Her daughter Lily sat quietly, her wide, hopeful eyes fixed on the tiny gift box in the center of the table, wrapped in crumpled blue paper she had found in one of Sarah's old drawers. Today was Lily's 7th birthday. Sarah had been saving every spare penny for months to buy her a simple gift. It wasn't much, a small bracelet with a heart charm, something she hoped would make her daughter feel special, even if just for a moment. A knock on the door broke the soft hum of their morning routine. Sarah's heart tightened. She knew that knock, sharp, impatient, a sound that always brought a rush of mixed emotions. Her father and sister, uninvited but unsurprising. Sarah opened the door, bracing herself. Her father, a tall, stern man with a graying beard, stepped in first, his eyes immediately scanning the modest apartment with thinly veiled disdain. Behind him, her sister Clara strutted in, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor. She wrinkled her nose at the faded wallpaper and cluttered corners. "Happy birthday, Lily," her father said with a forced smile, his tone dripping with false cheer. He glanced at the small box on the table, his eyes narrowing. "What's this?" he muttered, nudging the box with his rough, calloused hand. "It's my gift," Lily replied, her voice small but steady. She clutched her tiny hands together, a nervous habit she had inherited from her mother. Sarah noticed and gently placed her hand on her daughter's shoulder, offering a silent comfort. Clara's sharp laugh echoed through the tiny apartment. "A gift? From you?" she sneered, her red lips curling into a mocking smile. "With what money, Sarah? Did you finally get a real job, or are you still scribbling in that pathetic notebook of yours, dreaming of a life you'll never have?" Sarah felt her face flush, but she swallowed the sting. She had heard this too many times before to let it break her. She tightened her grip on Lily's shoulder. "Come on, Lily," Clara continued, leaning in close, her perfume overwhelming in the small space. "Kids like you shouldn't expect anything. You're just like your mother, worthless, always dreaming, never doing." Sarah's father chuckled, his deep voice cutting through the tension. "Well, she's right, you know. You can't raise a child on dreams, Sarah. She'll end up just like you, a disappointment." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Sarah felt her chest tighten, her throat burning as she tried to hold back the flood of emotions. But then, something shifted in Lily's eyes. She straightened her small shoulders, her tiny frame suddenly seeming so much larger, her eyes gleaming with a spark Sarah hadn't seen before. "Actually, Grandpa," Lily said softly, her voice clear and firm, surprising even herself, "I got you a gift too." The room fell silent. Even Clara's smug smile froze as Lily reached under the table and pulled out a small, plain white envelope. She held it out to her grandfather, her small fingers trembling slightly, but her gaze unflinching. For a moment he hesitated, staring at the envelope as if it were a trap. Then, with a scoff, he snatched it from her hand, tearing it open with a flick of his wrist. His eyes scanned the paper inside, his confident expression slowly dissolving into one of confusion, then disbelief, and finally, a pale, ghostly white. His hands trembled as he looked up, his cold gray eyes meeting Lily's steady, unblinking gaze. Clara leaned over, curiosity replacing her earlier mockery, but one glance at the paper in her father's shaking hands, and her smirk vanished. Lily took a deep breath, her small chest rising and falling as she locked eyes with her grandfather. "I thought you'd like to know," she whispered, her voice calm, yet chilling, "that sometimes, even small gifts can be powerful." Sarah watched as her father's hand trembled, the paper shaking between his fingers. His face, usually carved from stone, had lost all color. Clara's eyes darted between her father and the envelope, a flicker of nervousness replacing her usual smugness. What is this?" he stammered, his voice cracking for the first time in years. He looked down at the paper, then back at Lily, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water. Lily remained silent, her eyes never leaving his. The small girl who had once cowered under his harsh words now stood tall, her tiny fists clenched by her sides, radiating a quiet strength that even Sarah found surprising. Clara snatched the paper from their father's hand, her manicured nails scraping against his rough skin. She unfolded it quickly, her sharp eyes scanning the neat, childlike handwriting. "Grandpa," Lily said, her voice cutting through the tense silence, "I wanted you to know that I found those letters you wrote to Mom." Sarah's heart stopped. She felt the air leave her lungs as if someone had just punched her. Those letters. The ones she had hidden away in a forgotten corner of her closet, hoping Lily would never find them. Clara's eyes widened, her perfectly shaped eyebrows arching in shock. She read the paper again, her hands tightening around the thin sheet as if trying to crush the truth from it. "You said Mom was a burden," Lily continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You said she'd never amount to anything, that she was a mistake you wished you never had." Sarah felt a tear slip down her cheek. She had long grown numb to her father's cruel words, but hearing them echoed through her daughter's small, trembling voice sliced through her like a knife. "But you were wrong," Lily whispered, her eyes sharp, her jaw set. "Mom isn't worthless. She works hard every day. She takes care of me. She makes me pancakes on my birthday, even when she's tired, even when she doesn't have much." Clara's grip on the paper tightened, her face a mask of disbelief and anger. She turned to their father, her lips parting to speak, but no words came out. "And you know what, Grandpa?" Lily said, taking a small step forward, her chin lifted defiantly. "I'm not worthless either. I'm smart, I'm strong, and I'm loved." The words hit like a hammer, echoing off the faded wallpaper, reverberating through the tiny apartment. Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest, a fierce, protective pride she hadn't known she still had. For a long moment, no one moved. The only sound was the faint ticking of the old clock on the wall, counting down the seconds of their stunned silence. Then, without a word, Sarah's father crumpled the paper in his fist, his jaw tightening. He turned on his heel and stormed toward the door, his boots thudding against the thin carpet. Clara, still clutching the now crumpled letter, stumbled after him, her sharp heels clicking frantically as she tried to keep up. The door slammed behind them, the sound rattling the thin walls, making the single window shudder in its frame. For a moment, the apartment was silent again, the tension slowly draining away like the last flicker of a dying candle. Sarah dropped to her knees, pulling Lily into her arms, her body shaking with silent, relieved sobs. "I'm so proud of you, baby," she whispered into her daughter's soft hair, her tears soaking into the little girl's thin sweater. "So proud." Lily squeezed her mother tightly, her small arms surprisingly strong. "I know, Mom," she whispered back, her voice a soft, confident whisper against Sarah's ear. "I know." The days that followed felt different. The air in their small apartment felt lighter, the corners less shadowed by doubt and fear. Sarah noticed the change in Lily, too. She walked a bit taller, her steps more confident, her laughter a little louder, as if a weight she never should have carried had finally been lifted. One evening, as Sarah washed the few dishes they owned, she noticed Lily at the small, chipped dining table, scribbling in a notebook. She leaned closer, her wet hands dripping onto the counter as she watched her daughter write with intense focus, her small tongue poking out in concentration. "What are you working on, sweetheart?" Sarah asked, drying her hands and moving to sit across from her daughter. Lily looked up, her bright eyes meeting her mother's. For a moment, Sarah felt a pang of worry. She had seen that look before, a spark of defiance that reminded her too much of herself. "I'm writing a story, Mom," Lily said, flipping the notebook around to show a page filled with large, looping letters. "About a girl who stands up to a monster." Sarah's heart swelled with pride and a bit of unease. She reached across the table, brushing a stray curl from Lily's face. "That sounds like a very brave girl," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Lily nodded, her small hands clenching into fists. "She is," she said firmly, her eyes flashing with a determination that made Sarah's breath catch. "She's very brave." Before Sarah could respond, a sharp, rapid knock rattled their apartment door, the harsh sound echoing off the thin walls. Sarah's heart dropped, a familiar cold dread creeping into her veins. She stood slowly, exchanging a quick, worried glance with Lily before crossing the small room to the door. She hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the tarnished doorknob before pulling it open. Clara stood on the other side, her perfectly styled hair slightly askew, her eyes wild, her breaths coming in short, sharp bursts. She pushed past Sarah without a word, her sharp heels clicking against the floor as she stormed into the apartment. "Where is it?" Clara spat, her eyes darting around the cramped living room, her manicured nails digging into her designer handbag. Sarah closed the door slowly, her heart thudding loudly in her chest. "What are you talking about, Clara?" she asked, her voice steady but her fingers trembling. Clara whirled around, her sharp eyes locking onto Sarah's. "The letter," she hissed, her voice low and dangerous. "Where did she find it? Where did you hide it, Sarah?" Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She glanced quickly at Lily, who had frozen in her chair, her wide eyes darting between her mother and her aunt. "I don't know what you're talking about," Sarah replied, forcing her voice to remain calm. She crossed her arms over her chest, hoping her sister wouldn't notice the slight tremor in her hands. Clara let out a bitter, humorless laugh, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "Don't play dumb with me, Sarah," she snapped, stepping closer, her heels digging into the thin carpet. "You always were too soft, too weak to stand up for yourself, but this is going too far." Sarah felt a flicker of anger ignite in her chest, a tiny, rebellious spark she had tried to keep buried for years. She straightened her back, her chin lifting defiantly. "Maybe I'm not as weak as you think, Clara," she said quietly, her voice sharp despite the rapid pounding of her heart. Clara's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a sneer. She stepped closer, her perfectly painted nails tapping against her handbag, her eyes never leaving Sarah's. "You think you can change anything?" Clara whispered, leaning in until her face was inches from Sarah's. "You think one little girl's speech can undo all those years of failure? You're still the same scared little girl you've always been, hiding behind your notebooks and broken dreams." Sarah felt her pulse quicken, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. But before she could respond, a small voice cut through the tension, startling them both. "You're wrong, Aunt Clara," Lily said, her voice clear and strong despite the fear flickering in her wide eyes. She pushed back her chair, standing on shaky legs as she faced her aunt. Clara turned slowly, her sharp eyes narrowing as she looked down at her niece, her lips twisting into a mocking smirk. "Oh? And what do you know, little girl?" Lily took a deep breath, her small chest rising and falling as she steadied herself. "I know that you're afraid," she said quietly, her voice trembling but steady. "You're afraid that maybe, just maybe, you're the one who's worthless." The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting, slicing through the tension like a knife. Clara's face twisted into a mask of rage and disbelief, her cheeks flushing a deep, angry red. For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Then, without another word, Clara spun on her heel and stormed out of the apartment, the door slamming behind her so hard that the thin walls shuddered. Sarah collapsed into the nearest chair, her entire body shaking as she buried her face in her hands, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Lily moved slowly to her mother's side, slipping her small hand into Sarah's trembling one. She leaned in close, her soft curls brushing against her mother's tear-streaked cheek. "It's okay, Mom," she whispered, her voice soft and comforting. "We're stronger than they think." For the first time in a long while, Sarah believed her. Days passed, but Clara's sudden, rage-filled visit left a lingering unease in Sarah's small apartment. She tried to ignore the nagging fear that had crept back into her heart, but every creak of the old wooden floor, every shadow moving past the thin curtains, made her chest tighten with anxiety. Lily, however, seemed unaffected. She continued writing in her notebook, her small hands moving quickly across the pages, her brows furrowed in intense concentration. Sometimes Sarah would catch her whispering softly to herself as she wrote, her lips moving silently as if rehearsing a speech no one else could hear. One rainy afternoon, as the sky outside darkened and the steady patter of rain drummed against the cracked window, Sarah finally gathered the courage to ask. "Lily," she said, settling down beside her daughter on the frayed couch, the springs creaking under their combined weight. "What are you writing in that notebook of yours?" Lily looked up, her bright eyes meeting her mother's. She hesitated for a moment, her small fingers. She stood slowly, exchanging a quick, worried glance with Lily before crossing the small room to the door. She hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the tarnished doorknob before pulling it open. Clara stood on the other side, her perfectly styled hair slightly askew, her eyes wild, her breaths coming in short, sharp bursts. She pushed past Sarah without a word, her sharp heels clicking against the floor as she stormed into the apartment. "Where is it?" Clara spat, her eyes darting around the cramped living room, her manicured nails digging into her designer handbag. Sarah closed the door slowly, her heart thudding loudly in her chest. "What are you talking about, Clara?" she asked, her voice steady but her fingers trembling. Clara whirled around, her sharp eyes locking onto Sarah's. "The letter," she hissed, her voice low and dangerous. "Where did she find it? Where did you hide it, Sarah?" Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She glanced quickly at Lily, who had frozen in her chair, her wide eyes darting between her mother and her aunt. "I don't know what you're talking about," Sarah replied, forcing her voice to remain calm. She crossed her arms over her chest, hoping her sister wouldn't notice the slight tremor in her hands. Clara let out a bitter, humorless laugh, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "Don't play dumb with me, Sarah," she snapped, stepping closer, her heels digging into the thin carpet. "You always were too soft, too weak to stand up for yourself. But this is going too far." Sarah felt a flicker of anger ignite in her chest, a tiny, rebellious spark she had tried to keep buried for years. She straightened her back, her chin lifting defiantly. "Maybe I'm not as weak as you think, Clara," she said quietly, her voice sharp despite the rapid pounding of her heart. Clara's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a sneer. She stepped closer, her perfectly painted nails tapping against her handbag, her eyes never leaving Sarah's. "You think you can change anything?" Clara whispered, leaning in until her face was inches from Sarah's. "You think one little girl's speech can undo all those years of failure? You're still the same scared little girl you've always been, hiding behind your notebooks and broken dreams." Sarah felt her pulse quicken, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. But before she could respond, a small voice cut through the tension, startling them both. "You're wrong, Aunt Clara," Lily said, her voice clear and strong despite the fear flickering in her wide eyes. She pushed back her chair, standing on shaky legs as she faced her aunt. Clara turned slowly, her sharp eyes narrowing as she looked down at her niece, her lips twisting into a mocking smirk. "Oh? And what do you know, little girl?" Lily took a deep breath, her small chest rising and falling as she steadied herself. "I know that you're afraid," she said quietly, her voice trembling but steady. "You're afraid that maybe, just maybe, you're the one who's worthless." The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting, slicing through the tension like a knife. Clara's face twisted into a mask of rage and disbelief, her cheeks flushing a deep, angry red. For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Then, without another word, Clara spun on her heel and stormed out of the apartment, the door slamming behind her so hard that the thin walls shuddered. Sarah collapsed into the nearest chair, her entire body shaking as she buried her face in her hands, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Lily moved slowly to her mother's side, slipping her small hand into Sarah's trembling one. She leaned in close, her soft curls brushing against her mother's tear-streaked cheek. "It's okay, Mom," she whispered, her voice soft and comforting. "We're stronger than they think." For the first time in a long while, Sarah believed her. Days passed, but Clara's sudden, rage-filled visit left a lingering unease in Sarah's small apartment. She tried to ignore the nagging fear that had crept back into her heart, but every creak of the old wooden floor, every shadow moving past the thin curtains, made her chest tighten with anxiety. Lily, however, seemed unaffected. She continued writing in her notebook, her small hands moving quickly across the pages, her brows furrowed in intense concentration. Sometimes, Sarah would catch her whispering softly to herself as she wrote, her lips moving silently as if rehearsing a speech no one else could hear. One rainy afternoon, as the sky outside darkened and the steady patter of rain drummed against the cracked window, Sarah finally gathered the courage to ask. "Lily," she said, settling down beside her daughter on the frayed around the pencil before offering the notebook to Sarah. "It's a story," she whispered, her voice tinged with a hint of nervousness. "About a girl and her mother who find their strength, even when the world tries to break them." Sarah felt a lump rise in her throat as she glanced down at the messy, childlike scrawl filling the pages. She flipped through the notebook, her eyes skimming over sentences filled with small, hopeful words of courage and defiance. "She learns to be strong," Lily continued, her voice growing a bit bolder. "She learns that monsters aren't always the ones with sharp teeth or claws. Sometimes they're the ones who smile at you, the ones who say they love you, but only if you follow their rules." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She looked up, her eyes locking onto Lily's. "Where did you hear that, sweetheart?" she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Lily hesitated, her small fingers fidgeting with the corner of the notebook. "I heard Aunt Clara talking on the phone," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "She was yelling about you, and Grandpa, and something about money. She said you ruined everything, that you never should have had me." Sarah felt her heart shatter into a million pieces. She reached for her daughter, pulling her into a tight embrace, her tears soaking into Lily's soft curls. "I'm so sorry, baby," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry you had to hear that." Lily pulled back, her small hands resting on her mother's tear-streaked cheeks. "It's okay, Mom," she said firmly, her bright eyes shining with a fierce determination. "They don't scare me anymore. I know we're stronger than they think." Before Sarah could respond, another sharp knock echoed through the apartment. Sarah's blood ran cold. She glanced at the door, her heart pounding in her chest, the sound of her pulse roaring in her ears. Slowly, she stood, her legs trembling beneath her as she crossed the small room, her hand shaking as she reached for the doorknob. She pulled the door open, bracing herself for another confrontation. But instead of Clara or her father, a tall, unfamiliar man in a crisp suit stood on the other side. His face was sharp, his eyes cold, his expression unreadable. "Sarah Thompson?" he asked, his deep voice rumbling through the narrow hallway like distant thunder. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She tightened her grip on the doorknob, her nails digging into the worn metal. "Yes?" she replied, her voice barely more than a whisper. The man reached into his pocket, pulling out a thin, white envelope. He held it out to her, his expression never changing. "This is for you," he said simply, his eyes boring into hers. Sarah hesitated, her hand trembling as she reached out to take the envelope. She glanced down at the neat, precise handwriting on the front, her father's name scrawled in sharp, black ink. Before she could respond, the man turned and walked away, his polished shoes clicking against the chipped hallway tiles. Sarah watched him disappear down the stairs, her heart racing, her mind spinning. She closed the door slowly, leaning against it as she carefully tore open the envelope, her hands shaking so badly that the thin paper crumpled under her touch. Inside, she found a single sheet of paper. Her breath caught in her throat as her eyes skimmed the bold, unforgiving words written across the page. "Notice of eviction." The room seemed to tilt around her, the walls closing in as the words blurred before her eyes. She stumbled back, collapsing onto the couch beside Lily, the letter still clutched in her trembling hand. Lily looked up, her small face pale, her bright eyes filled with worry. "Mom?" she whispered, her voice small and scared. "What is it?" Sarah tried to speak, but her throat felt tight, her mouth dry, her mind blank. She looked down at her daughter, her beautiful, brave little girl, and felt a fresh wave of fear wash over her. For a long moment, they sat there in silence, the rain still tapping softly against the cracked window, the old clock ticking steadily on the wall. Then, slowly, Sarah felt something shift inside her, a deep, burning resolve she hadn't felt in years. She straightened her back, her trembling hands tightening into fists, her jaw clenching as she met Lily's wide, fearful eyes. "We're not giving up," she whispered fiercely, pulling her daughter into a tight embrace. "No matter what, we will fight. We will survive." The next morning, Sarah awoke to the dull, gray light seeping through the thin curtains, casting long, twisted shadows across the cracked walls. She sat up slowly, her back aching from a restless night on the lumpy couch, the eviction notice still crumpled on the small table beside her. She glanced over at Lily, still curled up under the thin, patched blanket, her small face peaceful in the soft morning glow. For a moment, Sarah felt a pang of guilt. She had promised to protect her daughter, to shield her from the harshness of the world, and yet here they were, one piece of paper away from losing the only home they had ever known. As she moved quietly to the kitchen, her bare feet cold against the chipped linoleum, Sarah's mind raced. She had no savings, no backup plan, and her low-paying job at the corner store barely covered the bills as it was, but she refused to let fear consume her. She had to stay strong for Lily. As she filled the kettle with water, her eyes caught on the small notebook still lying open on the kitchen table. She flipped it open, her fingers tracing the messy, childlike letters. "She learns to be strong," Lily had written. "She learns to fight, even when the world tries to break her." Sarah felt a small, stubborn flicker of hope ignite in her chest. She straightened her back, her jaw tightening as she set the kettle on the stove. She wouldn't let them break her. Not this time. Later that morning, as Lily munched on a piece of slightly stale toast, her legs swinging beneath the rickety kitchen chair, Sarah sat across from her, her hands clasped tightly together on the table. "Lily," she began, her voice steady but firm, "I need to talk to you about something." Lily looked up, her bright eyes curious but cautious. She set her toast down, crumbs scattering across the table. "What is it, Mom?" she asked, tilting her head slightly, her curls bouncing around her small face. Sarah took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. "We might have to move," she said slowly, forcing herself to hold her daughter's gaze. "We might have to leave this apartment." Lily's small face fell, her wide eyes filling with a mix of confusion and fear. "But why?" she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Sarah reached across the table, taking her daughter's small hand in her own. "Because sometimes the people who are supposed to protect us, they don't," she said quietly, her throat tightening with each word. "But that doesn't mean we have to give up. It just means we have to fight harder." Lily was silent for a long moment, her small fingers curling around her mother's hand, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Are we going to be okay, Mom?" she whispered, her voice so small, so fragile, that it nearly broke Sarah's heart. Sarah forced a smile, squeezing her daughter's hand tightly. "Yes, baby," she said firmly, her voice stronger than she felt. "We're going to be okay. I promise." As the days passed, Sarah threw herself into finding a solution. She took on extra shifts at the corner store, her tired hands aching as she stocked shelves and rang up customers late into the night. She sold off what little they had of value, pawning her mother's old locket and the small, cracked television that barely worked as it was. But even as their savings slowly grew, the fear of losing their home loomed over her like a dark, unrelenting shadow. She avoided her father's calls, knowing that any contact would only bring more threats, more insults, more reminders of the mistakes he claimed she could never escape. One evening, as Sarah sat at the kitchen table, her head in her hands, the sound of Lily's soft voice broke through the silence. "Mom," she whispered, slipping onto the chair beside her, "I think I have an idea." Sarah lifted her head, blinking back tears as she looked at her daughter, her small face glowing with a quiet, fierce determination. "What is it, baby?" she asked, forcing a weak smile. Lily reached for her notebook, flipping it open to a fresh, clean page. She picked up her pencil, her small hands moving quickly as she scribbled a few words across the top. "I want to tell our story," she said, her eyes bright, her small jaw set with a determination that took Sarah by surprise. "I want people to know what we've been through. Maybe someone will help us." Sarah felt a fresh wave of tears fill her eyes, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and fear. She reached for her daughter, pulling her into a tight embrace, her fingers tangling in the soft curls she had braided so many times over the years. "You're so brave, Lily," she whispered, her voice shaking. So brave." Lily hugged her mother back, her small arms surprisingly strong as she clung to her, her face pressed into her mother's shoulder. "I learned it from you, Mom," she whispered back, her voice muffled but filled with a fierce, unbreakable strength. And in that moment, Sarah felt the smallest flicker of hope ignite in her heart. She wasn't alone, she never had been, and together, she and her daughter would fight. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah and Lily poured their hearts into the small, worn notebook. They wrote late into the night, the dim kitchen light casting long shadows as their words filled the pages, each line a small act of defiance, each paragraph a quiet rebellion against the fear that had ruled their lives for so long. At first, Sarah had been hesitant. The idea of sharing their struggles, their pain, their darkest moments, felt like tearing open an old wound. But Lily's quiet determination, her fierce belief in their strength, had slowly chipped away at her fear. One evening, as they sat side by side at the small, cluttered table, Lily looked up from the notebook, her small face serious, her bright eyes filled with a determination that made Sarah's heart swell. "Mom," she whispered, her voice steady but intense, "we should share this. We should tell people our story." Sarah froze, her heart skipping a beat. She glanced down at the messy pages, the ink smudged from their long, late-night writing sessions, and felt a wave of uncertainty wash over her. "But what if no one cares?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What if they just ignore us? What if they laugh at us?" Lily shook her head firmly, her small hands tightening into fists. "They won't," she said confidently. "Because we're not alone. There are other people out there like us, people who need to know they're not alone either." Sarah felt a tear slip down her cheek, her chest tightening with a mix of fear and pride. She reached for her daughter, pulling her into a tight embrace, her fingers tangling in Lily's soft curls. "Okay," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Let's do this. Let's tell our story." The next day, Sarah took a deep breath and created a simple blog. She chose a plain white background, the clean lines and simple font, a sharp contrast to the chaos and pain they had poured into the pages of the notebook. She titled it "Silent Voices" and uploaded their first post, a raw, emotional account of the years of fear and control they had endured, the small, everyday acts of resistance that had kept them going, the quiet moments of strength that had kept them alive. At first, the response was slow. A few likes, a handful of encouraging comments, the occasional message of support. But as the days passed, their small blog began to grow. More and more people found their way to their little corner of the internet, sharing their own stories of survival, their own struggles, their own small victories. One evening, as Sarah scrolled through the dozens of comments pouring in, her eyes filling with tears at the outpouring of support, Lily leaned over her shoulder, her small face glowing with pride. "See, Mom?" she whispered, her voice trembling with excitement. "I told you we weren't alone." Sarah felt her heart swell with a fierce, unbreakable pride. She reached for her daughter, pulling her into a tight embrace, her tears soaking into Lily's soft curls. "We're going to be okay, baby," she whispered, her voice shaking with a mix of relief and disbelief. "We're really going to be okay." But even as their small blog continued to grow, as the supportive messages poured in from all corners of the world, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong, that they were still being watched, still being hunted. One evening, as she sat alone in the small, dimly lit apartment, her fingers trembling as she typed out another emotional blog post, her phone buzzed sharply on the table beside her. She glanced down, her heart skipping a beat as her father's name flashed across the screen. For a long moment she just stared at the phone, her mind racing, her heart pounding in her chest. Then, slowly, she reached for it, her fingers shaking as she swiped the screen. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. There was a long, tense pause on the other end, the crackle of static filling the silence. Then her father's deep, gravelly voice cut through the line, cold and sharp as broken glass. "I know what you're doing, Sarah," he snarled, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you can just walk away? You think you can just share our family secrets and get away with it?" Sarah felt her blood run cold, her heart pounding so loudly in her ears that she could barely hear his words. "I don't know what you're talking about," she whispered, forcing her voice to remain steady. Her father let out a bitter, humorless laugh, the sound sending a chill down her spine. "Don't play dumb, girl," he snapped, his voice dripping with rage. "I saw your little blog, your pathetic attempt to turn people against me. You always were a troublemaker just like your mother." Sarah felt a wave of anger wash over her, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. She straightened her back, her jaw tightening as she forced herself to stand her ground. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," she whispered, her voice trembling but fierce. "You can't control me. You can't control us. Not anymore." There was another long, tense silence on the other end of the line, the crackle of static growing louder, more menacing. Then, her father spoke again, his voice low and cold, each word dripping with venom. "You have no idea what you've just started," he whispered, his voice so quiet that Sarah had to strain to hear him. "But don't worry, Sarah," her mind already shifting into survival mode. She crossed the small room in a few quick, shaky steps, her fingers fumbling as she unlocked the small door at the end of the hallway. Lily stirred as the door creaked open, her small, sleepy face peeking out from beneath the thin, patched blanket. "Mom?" she whispered, her voice thick with sleep, her bright eyes blinking in the dim light. Sarah knelt beside the small, creaky bed, her hands trembling as she reached for her daughter, pulling her into a tight embrace, her tears soaking into Lily's soft curls. "We have to go, baby," she whispered, her voice breaking, her heart racing. "We have to go now." Lily pulled back, her small face filled with confusion and fear, her bright eyes wide as she clutched her small notebook tightly to her chest. "But why?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Where are we going?" Sarah forced a weak, trembling smile, her fingers brushing gently through her daughter's curls, her heart breaking at the fear in her small, innocent eyes. "Somewhere safe," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Somewhere they can't hurt us anymore." Lily hesitated for a moment, her small hands tightening around her notebook, her wide eyes still filled with fear. "Okay," she whispered, her voice trembling but fierce, her small jaw set with a determination that took Sarah by surprise. "Okay, Mom." And as they gathered their few belongings, their hearts pounding, their hands shaking, Sarah felt a small, stubborn flicker of hope ignite in her chest. They weren't alone. Not anymore. The night air was sharp and bitter as Sarah and Lily slipped out of their small apartment, their few belongings crammed into a single worn backpack slung over Sarah's shoulder. The city around them was quiet, the streets slick with rain, the distant hum of traffic the only sound as they hurried through the darkened alleyways, their breaths coming in short, sharp gasps. Sarah clutched Lily's small hand tightly in her own, her heart pounding as they moved quickly, their footsteps echoing against the wet pavement. She felt the cold, sharp bite of fear clawing at her chest, her mind racing with 1,000 what-ifs, but she forced herself to keep moving, her jaw clenched, her eyes fixed on the distant glow of the city lights. They reached the bus station just as the first, faint hints of dawn began to creep over the horizon, the soft gray light casting long, twisted shadows across the cracked pavement. Sarah pulled Lily close, her arm wrapped tightly around her daughter's small shoulders as they slipped into the dimly lit terminal, their eyes darting nervously around the nearly empty space. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she spotted a tall, shadowy figure lingering near the corner of the terminal, his head lowered, his face hidden beneath the hood of a dark, tattered sweatshirt. She felt a cold wave of fear wash over her, her fingers tightening around Lily's small, trembling hand as she hurried them toward the ticket counter. "One way," she whispered to the tired-looking clerk behind the scratched, fogged-up glass. "Anywhere but here." The clerk blinked, his eyes red-rimmed and glassy, his hands shaking slightly as he slid 2 crumpled tickets through the small slot at the bottom of the glass. Sarah fumbled for her wallet, her fingers shaking as she counted out the crumpled bills and loose change she had scraped together, her heart racing as the shadowy figure shifted slightly in the corner of her vision. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling as she grabbed the tickets, her heart pounding as she pulled Lily close and hurried toward the narrow, dimly lit hallway leading to the loading bays. They found a small, empty corner near the back of the terminal, the cold, cracked tile rough beneath them as they huddled together, their breaths coming in short, sharp gasps, their hearts racing as they listened to the distant rumble of the approaching bus. Lily clutched her small notebook tightly to her chest, her wide eyes darting nervously around the dimly lit space, her small body trembling as she leaned into her mother's side. "Mom," she whispered, her voice trembling, her small fingers clutching at the frayed edge of Sarah's jacket. What if he finds us?" Sarah felt her chest tighten, her heart skipping a beat as she glanced around the nearly empty terminal, her eyes locking briefly with the shadowy figure still lingering near the corner, his head still lowered, his face still hidden beneath the dark, tattered hood. "He won't," she whispered, her voice fierce, her jaw clenched, her eyes narrowing as she tightened her arm around her daughter's small, trembling shoulders. "We won't let him." The bus pulled into the terminal with a low, rumbling roar, the hiss of the air brakes cutting through the thick, suffocating silence. Sarah rose slowly, her legs shaking, her fingers tightening around Lily's small, trembling hand as they moved quickly toward the narrow, grimy door. The driver, a tired-looking man with deep, dark circles beneath his eyes, barely glanced at them as they climbed the narrow, creaking steps, their footsteps echoing sharply against the cold metal floor. Sarah guided Lily to a small, cramped seat near the back of the bus, her heart still racing, her mind still spinning as she pulled her daughter close, her arm wrapped tightly around her small, trembling shoulders. As the bus pulled out of the terminal, the dim, flickering streetlights casting long, twisted shadows across the cracked, rain-soaked pavement, Sarah felt a small, stubborn flicker of hope ignite in her chest. They were leaving. They were finally, truly leaving. The city lights slowly faded into the distance, the harsh, unforgiving skyline replaced by the soft, rolling hills and dense, shadowy forests of the countryside. Sarah leaned her head back against the cold, vibrating window, her eyes slipping shut as the steady, rhythmic rumble of the bus engine filled her ears, her heart slowly beginning to calm, her mind slowly beginning to quiet. Lily shifted beside her, her small body warm and solid against her side, her soft, even breaths, a quiet, steady reminder that they were still alive, still moving, still fighting. For the first time in what felt like forever, Sarah allowed herself to dream of a future. A real, tangible future. Free from the fear and control that had ruled her life for so long. But as the sun slowly rose over the distant hills, casting a warm, golden glow across the dark, twisting road, Sarah felt a familiar, bitter twist of fear coil in her chest. She glanced down at her phone, the screen still dark and silent in her lap, her heart skipping a beat as she remembered her father's final, chilling words. "You have no idea what you've just started." But as she glanced down at Lily, her small, peaceful face glowing in the soft morning light, her small hands still clutching the worn, battered notebook tightly to her chest, Sarah felt a fierce, unbreakable resolve harden in her heart. They had come too far, fought too hard. They weren't just running anymore, they were fighting back. And this time, she would not break.